Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
The American Civil War, or the war between the states, however we choose to call it, was probably one of the most defining moments in our nation's history. And the role of women during that time period, 1861 to 1865, was a major one indeed. Martha Reedy Morgan was truly a woman ahead of her time. Having grown up down the street from where she lived and was married, I became intrigued with her persona at a very early age. Her house was still standing while I was growing up, even though it had been converted to shops and offices. The research for this program actually began as a history class term paper when I was challenged to write about a local persona of the Civil War era. Martha Reedy immediately came to mind, and in the mid-1960s, I found the sum total of 2 sentences about her. She was the wife of Confederate General John Hunt Morgan, and she was from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Dr. Robert Corlew, my history professor, didn't feel that this was quite sufficient for a term paper, unfortunately. So he provided a few ideas for me to pursue, like checking with any descendants still in the area and trying to set up interviews with them. He gave me a couple of weeks to try to find out a little bit more about her. My first interview was with Mr. Gene Sloan on the MTSU campus, who was from Lebanon and actually knew Maddie's own daughter, Martha Reedy Williamson Bone, Mrs. Winstead Bone. Mr. Sloan also had an interest in Maddie and had some great information that had been provided to him by Mrs. Bone. By the time that I had finished talking to people and gleaning from them their thoughts and remembrances, and actually having the privilege to look at some of their wonderful family treasures, my 2-page paper had suddenly turned into almost 20 handwritten pages. Thus my work when Martha Reedy Morgan began, over a half a century ago. I got busy with other things, got married, finished college, began my working career, had a son, and just let Maddie rest for about 20 years. Then in the mid-1980s, I was one of the founding members of a newly formed UDC chapter, to be entitled Martha Reedy Morgan, Chapter 2487. So I dug out my old handwritten school papers and began to take a new look at Miss Maddie. She had been more or less overlooked by history and not always treated too kindly in the process. I interviewed Mrs. Bone's daughter, Mrs. Samuel Gilreath, again, and had several nice talks with her, and then wrote an expanded article about Maddie, which was published in the UDC magazine in 1990, the first one that had ever been published on her. In 1992, I had the privilege of doing some research for artist John Paul Strain for his limited edition print, Morgan's Wedding. While this was to deal primarily with Morgan, the tremendous impact that Maddie had on his life and career jumped out at me big time. So once again, I got out my notes and my research and took another look at the life of Martha Reedy Morgan. I interviewed another descendant of Maddie's, Tenny Hooker Bushell, her great-granddaughter living in Nashville. Tenny was very gracious and served me tea out of Maddie's own teapot with the initials MRM on the side. She allowed me to try on the pearls that John had given Maddie for a wedding gift. They fit perfectly. She shared with me a scrapbook that Maddie had put together lovingly for little Johnny, her daughter, born after John's death, and many other family portraits and treasures. I must say that it has been an extraordinary experience meeting the Reedy descendants, all of whom have been lovely to me over the course of 5 decades, and they even made me an honorary Reedy cousin at a Reedy family reunion some years back. But like any family, there were some real characters that I encountered, including John J. Hooker. Do any of you all remember that name? This was Maddie's great-grandson. In 1994, right after the John Paul's Strain print came out, there was quite a bit of press in the Nashville Tennessean and the Nashville Banner. And I came in from work one afternoon and my phone was just ringing off the hook. And I grabbed it and said hello, and the boy said, "Is this Shirley Ferris Jones?" And I said, "Yes, sir, it is." He said, "Do you know who this is?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't believe I do." He said, "This is John J. Hooker, and I think I have something you want." I said, "I beg your pardon?" And with that, he began to tell me that he had John Hunt Morgan's watch. And he was willing to part company with it, and for $6,000, it could be mine. Well, I asked a couple of questions. Does the watch have JHM on it? No. Is there a picture of John Hunt Morgan with his watch in his pocket? No. Do you have a certificate of authenticity? No. He said, "Young woman, you'll just have to trust me." Well, I didn't. That watch got away. And it really, in all fairness, it may have been John Hunt Morgan's watch. But 2 weeks later, John J. Hooker declared bankruptcy. I guess that was my fault. But Maddie was truly an extraordinary woman. So I guess it's only fitting that she should have some extraordinarily colorful characters in her family. I revisited Miss Maddie again in 2002 when the research was further expanded into the current version of Martha Reedy Morgan, From Wife to Widow in 630 Days, and presented it at a Cumberland Valley Civil War Heritage Symposium. I was honored that my efforts earned the Jefferson Davis Award for Writing and Research in 2004. The more I came to know of Maddie Reedy, the more I came to admire her courage and respect her dignity, most of all her strength, in very difficult times and situations. She was truly, as you will see, a most extraordinary young woman for that day and time. The dashing, daring, celebrated General John Hunt Morgan wouldn't have married just anybody. He was from a wealthy, aristocratic, bluegrass Kentucky background and greatly admired throughout the hard-pressed Southland as its most celebrated hero. In her own mid-19th century way, Maddie Reedy was the bull-riding general's match in every aspect. And the thunderbolt of the Confederacy was captured by her charms and fell in love, probably for the first time in his life, with Murfreesboro's own Southern Belle. She found the kinder, gentler, and very loving heart of this great cavalryman, and the intense love they shared would change both of their lives forever. Probably theirs was the most famous Christmas wedding ever to take place in Murfreesboro, almost 161 years ago, and folks still remember it today. It was most definitely the social highlight of the Confederacy. So, please travel back in time with me as we join Miss Martha Reedy on her journey from wife to widow in 630 days. The Civil War was a time of uncertainty, especially for those living in the recently established Confederate States of America. Happiness was a brief interlude from the reality of the horrors and deprivations inflicted upon a people trying to protect their homeland. For some, it was a bittersweet time of both joy and sorrow. And that is the story of Martha Reedy of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and John Hunt Morgan of Lexington, Kentucky. Martha Reedy was born near Murfreesboro on June 21st, 1840. She was the sixth of 8 children and the second of 4 girls born to Colonel Charles Reedy Jr. and Martha Strong Reedy. Affectionately known as Maddie, she was described as being a very attractive young woman of medium height with a shapely figure, a fair, creamy complexion, large blue eyes, and dark hair. Both she and Sister Alice attended the prestigious Soule College in Murfreesboro and the Nashville Female Academy during the 1850s, where it was noted that young ladies could receive traditional Southern education for women in cultural studies and social graces. That's her sister Alice. Colonel Reedy was a very successful Murfreesboro attorney, twice mayor of the city in 1832, and then again 1849 to 1853, and a very influential member of the Whig Party. He served Tennessee as a United States representative before the Civil War and a judge afterwards. While in Washington with her family, Maddie was known to be a favorite among society. She was the first girl in Washington to wear a curl on her forehead, and was soon imitated by 100 others. She was described as being one of the prettiest daughters of Old South society and a fashion trendsetter at 18. She had many suitors while in Washington, both there and at home in Murfreesboro. 36-year-old Illinois Representative Samuel Scott Marshall was among the most persistent in wanting to marry her. Although considered a very good choice, she decided that she would not marry him simply because she didn't love him. And 3 years later, this same man came knocking on her door in Murfreesboro as an officer of an invading army. The Reedy family was among the earliest and most prominent Rutherford County families. They were well educated, had extensive land holdings, owned many slaves, and in every way were representative of the aristocratic antebellum society of the South. The 1840s and 1850s were prosperous times for the people of Rutherford County and would reach a peak in economic, educational, and social areas not to be experienced again until after the turn of the century. The Reedys were known to be strong supporters of the Confederacy and offered both support and hospitality to the officers encamped in the area, including Captain John Hunt Morgan, the dashing cavalryman from Kentucky, who arrived in Middle Tennessee late February of 1862, following the fall of Fort Donelson on February the 16th. John Hunt Morgan was born in Huntsville, Alabama on June 1st, 1825. The first of 10 children of Henrietta and Calvin Morgan, John was named for his millionaire maternal grandfather, John Wesley Hunt of Lexington. Although Calvin Morgan tried various ways to become a successful businessman and provide adequately for his family, failing business ventures finally forced him to relocate the family to Lexington when John was 6, thus becoming dependent upon the Hunts for their livelihood and affluent lifestyle. John Morgan had inherited by birth the status of aristocracy. Very handsome, he was 6 feet tall, with a strong and attractive athletic body, and exhibited excellent horsemanship. As a young man, he was very bashful and did not feel comfortable speaking before a group. His college career at Transylvania University proved quite disappointing, and he was suspended for dueling in 1844. John entered the military in 1846 after 2 frustrating years of trying to find himself, and was elected 2nd Lieutenant of Company K of the Kentucky Volunteers in the war against Mexico. He was then promptly promoted to 1st Lieutenant of Kentucky's Mounted Volunteers, 1st Regiment. He distinguished himself as a hero at the Battle of Buena Vista, and although his enlistment was up and the war over, He wanted desperately to continue his military career. He had gained self-confidence through his experiences of war and enjoyed being welcomed home as a conquering hero. More importantly, he had distinguished himself as a Morgan of honor. He had acquired 1 year of military experience, although discipline was lax and contempt for authority prevalent. This would shape his future military actions. Morgan settled down in Lexington and entered into business with his friend, Bruce Sanders. The Bruce family lived across the street from Hopemont, Morgan's ancestral home, and were considered an established manufacturing family and were considered a very wealthy, successful, and respected family. Perhaps it was only natural that John should then marry Sanders' sister, Rebecca Bruce. He was 23, and she was 18 years old on their wedding day in 1853. After 5 years of marriage, she gave birth to their first and only child, a son who was stillborn. From that point on, for the duration of her life, Becky would remain a victim of poor health, despite trips to various doctors and places in a fruitless attempt to find a cure for her afflictions. After existing several years as an invalid, confined to her bed for many months, she finally died on July 21st of 1861. During this time, Morgan's behavior was typical of so many Southern gentlemen of his time. With Becky and his relatives, he was always respectful. Yet Morgan never denied himself any of the worldly pleasures. He was known as a favorite among women, good-looking, well-dressed, as well as a gambler and libertine. Morgan's brother-in-law and best friend, Basil Duke, expounded the Southern code of ethics when he pointed out that Morgan never attempted to be secretive or hypocritical about his diversions, and he never did anything which touched his integrity as a man and his honor as a gentleman. Duke later wrote, like the great majority of the men of his class, the gentlemen of the South, he lived freely, and the amusements he permitted himself would, doubtless, have shocked the New Englander almost as much as the money he spent in obtaining them. General Morgan, with the virtues, had some of the faults of his Southern blood and country. Meanwhile, John's business ventures, many of which were dependent upon the institution of slavery, flourished. By the late 1850s, the Southern system of honor was wholly identifiable in the character of John Morgan, and he had established his identity and respectability as captain of the Lexington Rifles and entered into the romantic social life of antebellum Lexington. When all of this was threatened, John Morgan was more than ready to go to war. Kentucky found herself a state divided, unable to choose between North and South, and therefore took the position of peace and neutrality. Morgan, however, aligned himself with other Southern sympathizers in the state, and the Lexington Rifles were among the first volunteer companies to join the State Guard, a newly created pro-Southern state militia organization in 1860. In September of 1861, the Lexington Rifles left to join Confederate forces, and shortly thereafter, Morgan began his own type of warfare against the enemy that had driven him from his home. He entered into it with both intensity and enjoyment, which is apparent from his raids along the Green River. After General Albert Sidney Johnston's defensive line in Kentucky collapsed early in 1862, Morgan's command became part of the thin screen thrown out to protect Johnston's army from Union divisions under General Buell in Nashville. On February the 27th, 1862, following the fall of Nashville, Morgan moved his headquarters to near Murfreesboro. Shortly thereafter, Colonel Reedy was visiting the camp near Laverne when he met Captain Morgan, and he invited him to dinner. He sent a slave home with word that the famous Captain Morgan is coming, and tell Maddie I want her to sing for him. In a diary entry of March the 3rd, 1862, Sister Alice describes a visit by Captain Morgan to the Reedy home the previous evening. She said, "Morgan is an extremely modest man, but very pleasant and agreeable, though one to see him would scarcely imagine him to be the daring, reckless man he is. An immense crowd collected at the front door to see him, and 2 or 3 actually came in and stood before the parlor door." Although his stay in Murfreesboro was brief, the 36-year-old Captain Morgan made quite an impression on 21-year-old Maddie. Following an expedition to Gallatin, Morgan returned to Murfreesboro to find Union cavalry conducting a reconnaissance outside the town. He sent Maddie a note asking whether the town was clear of Federals. She hurriedly penned a reply, "They are 8 miles from here, come in haste," and handed it to a courier, who returned to Morgan 10 miles to the north. A few hours later, in the early morning, Morgan appeared. He and Maddie talked until daylight, and family tradition holds that they became engaged on that March the 19th, 3 weeks after they met. Things happened fast. At dawn, John bade goodbye to Maddie by forming the soldiers on the square and leading in the singing of Cheer Boys Cheer. Maddie was known for her spirit. One day in late spring of 1862, while Murfreesboro was under federal occupation, Maddie was crossing the street in front of her house, just across from the courthouse, when she overheard some Union soldiers making hateful remarks about Morgan. They called him a horse thief. She stepped in and gave the Yankees a royal scolding and stomped her foot. When one of the soldiers asked her her name, she replied, "It's Maddie Reedy now. But by the grace of God, one day I hope to call myself the wife of John Morgan." Shortly after that, General Nathan Bedford Forrest was back, giving Murfreesboro a brief reprieve from federal rule. Morgan was back in the area by early September, harassing the Yankees and seeing Miss Maddie at every available opportunity. After a brief courtship, John presented Maddie with one of the most unusual wedding presents in history. Following a battle with Union forces in Hartsville on December the 7th of 1862, more than 1,800 federal soldiers were captured. They were marched to Murfreesboro as captives, where John presented them to Maddie, and as to their disposition, which became her choice. That army of discomfited boys in blue came to be known as General Morgan's wedding present to his bride. I bet she preferred the pearls, though. The wedding of John and Maddie was held at the Reedy home near the courthouse on the square in Murfreesboro on Sunday evening, December the 14th, 1862. The Reedy house was described as having been built in the 1850s and being a 2-story wooden structure facing East Main Street along the whole block where Bank of America is today. The house actually occupied the second lot facing East Main Street. The first lot was an ornamental garden with twin magnolia trees right across from the courthouse. Inside the house was a large hall with flanking parlors. One of these parlors served as the scene of the wedding. This grand home was the scene of much gaiety and hospitality and headquarters for both armies during the war. The wedding was one of the great social occasions of the Confederacy. Groomsmen were Maddie's brother, Horace Reedy, an officer on General William J. Hardee's staff, and Colonel George St. Leger Benfield, an English soldier of fortune. General Leonidas Pope, Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Louisiana, nephew of former United States President James K. Polk, and commander of a corps of Bragg's army encamped around Murfreesboro, performed the ceremony. Maddie, although raised a Presbyterian, had become an Episcopalian just prior to her marriage, as that was the faith of the Morgan family, although Morgan himself was not a very religious man. Generals Bragg, Hardee, Cheatham, and Breckinridge, including the headquarters staff, were all in attendance. President Jefferson Davis in Murfreesboro the day before the wedding, when he had promoted Morgan to Brigadier General, had left early that morning and was on his way to Montgomery, Alabama. In an August 31st, 1912 issue, General Basil Duke of Louisville recalled to a News Banner reporter his memories of that great celebration. All the officers of high rank who could reach Murfreesboro had assembled for the wedding, General Bragg among them. Distinguished civilians were present in great numbers. The house was packed with people to its full capacity and decorated with holly and winter berries. The lights from lamps and candles flashed on the uniforms and the trappings of the officers and were reflected in the bright eyes of the pretty Tennessee girls who had gathered. The raven-haired, black-mustached Morgan in his general's uniform, looking like a hero of chivalry. The bride, a girl of rare beauty, tall, dark-haired, and blue eyes with a creamy complexion and perfect features, and standing before them to perform the ceremony in his full military uniform, Bishop Polk, himself a general of the Confederate Army and bishop of the Episcopal Church. Miss Reedy's bridal dress was one of her best antebellum frocks, for it was not possible at that time to purchase material for a trousseau. General Duke was certain that the bride could not have worn anything more becoming. He remembers that she also wore a bridal veil. General Morgan's attendants were as dashing a set of young soldiers as any bride could wish for at her wedding. 2 or 3 regimental bands had been provided for the occasion. They were stationed in the house and on the porch. And there was plenty of music. Outside in the streets, thousands of soldiers were assembled, who, by the lighted bonfires, celebrated the wedding proper style, cheering Morgan and his bride. After the wedding, there was a great supper served in the Reedy mansion where the wedding party and invited guests feasted. Turkeys, hams, chickens, ducks, game, and all the delicacies and good dishes the Southern kitchen could produce were on the board, while Colonel Reedy's cellar still had a sufficient stock of wine to provide for the many toasts proposed to the happy couple. After the wedding supper, the bands were called in, and the gallant soldiers and Tennessee belles danced to their heart's content. The next evening, on Monday, December the 15th, 1862, the day after their wedding, a grand ball was held at the courthouse in honor of John and Maddie. The ball was sponsored by the 1st Louisiana and the 6th Kentucky regiments. Candles illuminated the large hallways of the 3-year-old courthouse, and behind each candle, a bayonet reflected the light on the festive scene. A pyramidal chandelier of bayonets and candles hung from the ceiling, and trees of greenery and jars of flowers decorated the dance hall. Unfortunately, the good times were about to come to a screeching halt. Maddie loved her husband deeply, and despite the hardships of war, tried to be with him whenever and wherever she could. 1 week after the wedding, General Morgan rode off on the Christmas raid into Kentucky in search of much needed horses and supplies. Maddie accompanied him as far as she could, to Alexandria, Tennessee, and together they watched the grand parade of Morgan's troops, which had never looked better. Everyone admired the handsome couple and their obvious affection for one another. The next day, on December the 22nd, the newlyweds were separated when Morgan and his men rode north into Kentucky and Maddie returned to Murfreesboro. The second day of the raid, on December the 23rd, John wrote Maddie that he hoped it would be finished within 6 days. He said, And then, my precious one, I shall try to get back to you as fast as possible. And my pretty one, nothing shall induce me to leave you again this winter. How anxiously I am looking forward to the moment when I shall again clasp you to a heart that beats for you alone. Do not forget me, my own darling, and you may rest assured that my whole thoughts are of you. Farewell, my pretty wife. My command is leaving, and I must be off. John Morgan was a man in love, probably for the first time in his life. The raid was a great success, and John and Maddie hoped that it would help to dispel speculations that marriage came first, career second. Colonel Grenfell had participated in the wedding, but said later that he had attempted to prevent it, as he felt that marriage would cause John Morgan to become cautious and less enterprising. And Maddie's family had instructed her, you must remember your promises, not to display the general in his career of glory, but encourage him to go forward. She promised, but she did not know what a profound influence she would have on his life and career. He was her hero, her knight in shining armor. Following the raid, he wrote to her, the greatest pleasure my expedition has afforded is the knowledge that our great success will gratify and delight you. There were hints that Maddie slowed Morgan down, took away his strength and courage, and sent his career on a downward spiral. The wedding had come at the peak of his career, one day after his promotion to Brigadier General. But instead of encouraging him to settle down to regular cavalry service, the relationship with Maddie seems to just have added to the psychological pressure to continue independent raids, even to the point of recklessness and insubordination. Maddie returned home to Murfreesboro just in time for the Battle of Stones River, which began on December the 31st. The Reedy family, like the rest of the townspeople, were spared none of the horrors of the battle as the battle raged around them. 2 weeks later, following Bragg's retreat from Middle Tennessee, Maddie and her lovely sister Alice were forced to take flight from home. The Reedy home was used by Union General Rosecrans for his headquarters. Charles Reedy Jr., as well as his son-in-law, Dr. William C. Cheatham of Nashville, who was married to Maddie's oldest sister, Mary Emma, had both been arrested previously by the Federals for their participation in rebel resistance. And Maddie, being married to the notorious General Morgan, could have become a target had she chosen to stay. When Maddie left Murfreesboro, she did not know that she would not see her parents again until after the war, and that her sister, Mary Emma, would die during that time frame. Even correspondence or communication of any kind with her family would be very limited. So Maddie left home, and under escort by members of General Morgan's staff, she and Alice reached the Army at Tullahoma. On January the 12th of 1863, she received an invite from Colonel T.B. Roy. He said, Tullahoma, Tennessee, January the 12th, 1863. Mrs. Morgan, the General invites you and Miss Alice to spend the day with us and offers you camp fare and a soldier's welcome. He has secured a nice little room for you across the way and trusts to be able to make a day or two stay very pleasant. Hoping you have enjoyed the visit of your general and that you may be made happy again very soon, I remain very truly T.B. Roy. Mrs. General Morgan. P.S. If the general is off by chances to be with you, we shall be glad to see him as well. 3 weeks after the wedding, on January the 6th, Maddie wrote him from newly established headquarters in Winchester. She said, come to me, my darling, quickly. I was wretched, but now I am almost happy, and will be quite so when my precious husband is again with with me. I can bear anything, darling, as long as you are with me, and so long as I have your love. But when we are separated, I know that you are surrounded by so many dangers and hardships as you have been on your last expedition. I become a weak, nervous child. Have I not lived a great deal, love, in the last 3 weeks? Oh, I had some dark days, dearest, and when the battle was raging around me in such fury, and everybody from the commander-in-chief to the privates were praying for Morgan to come, I thank God in the anguish of my heart that it was not for me to say where you should be. There was one continual inquiry at the front door. When will General Morgan be here? We reached here today, and although an entire stranger to the people I am with, they received me, as the saying is, with open arms, because I am your wife. We are comfortably but very plainly accommodated. Alice is with me. Papa and Mama remained at home with Ella. I almost dread to hear from them. I am at Mrs. McGee's, just in the suburbs of the town, so you will know exactly where to find me. Good night, my hero. My dreams are of you. Your most affectionate, Maddie. One of General Morgan's first priority was to bring Maddie to his new headquarters in McMinnville. He wrote, "Am determined to have you near me. Cannot bear the thought of your being away from home and my not being with you." Once she came, Maddie declared, "My life is all a joyous dream now from which I fear to awaken, and awake I must when my hero is called to leave me again. My husband wants me to remain with him, and of course I much prefer it. They say we are a lovesick couple." This devotion to each other was reflected in John Morgan's military leadership. After long and strenuous marches, even when the strongest men were exhausted, he would ride another 50 miles to be with her. Some of his men felt that Maddie diverted his attention, and he had lost his single-minded devotion to the cause. One night, anticipating attack from the enemy, he wrote to her, "Although I fully expected to be attacked today, still my thoughts were of you and not of war." 25 miles from the hardship of the front of battle, John and Maddie extended their honeymoon into the spring. Nearly every afternoon they made an elegant appearance riding horseback into the country. She in a beautiful black riding habit, hat and veil. He in a blue roundabout jacket with brass buttons, blue pants tucked into shiny cavalry boots with spurs, and black felt hat fastened up at the side. A correspondent for the Richmond Enquirer observed that Maddie's full-blown figure was certainly apropos to the sterling manhood of Morgan. She loves him very ardently, and I doubt not that the affair was entirely one of the affections. They take long strolls every afternoon, and the evidence of attachment are delicate and dignified upon both sides. Maddie was pregnant. Maddie's influence extended even further. For the first time in his life, John Morgan became interested in religion. Maddie had given him a prayer book for a wedding present, and from a camp far away from her one night he wrote, "The dear prayer book that you gave me, my dear precious one, is before me, and I shall read evening prayer, 21st day. So, my angel, you see what a good influence you exert upon me, and I am so much happier." His mother was also happier and quite pleased to learn that because of Maddie's example and advice, he had become a much better man. He was adamant that his newly found faith sprang from his love for Maddie, and he was subordinate to that love for her. He further wrote, "I shall read your letter again before I close my eyes. What great pleasure it affords me to read your dear sweet words of love. I know every word you utter comes from your dear good heart. Have more confidence in that than I have in this little prayer book before me." As previously noted, Morgan was not really a religious man, but he wanted to please her. With Middle Tennessee under federal occupation and Maddie choosing to remain with John behind Confederate lines, Arrangements for Maddie's escape in case of an enemy attack were almost first and foremost in his mind. John provided an ambulance and a wagon and kept her informed on the most feasible escape route. She kept her bags packed for immediate evacuation. On April the 19th, 1863, Colonel Robert Minty, who commanded the 1st Brigade of Michigan Cavalry, burst through picket lines and into Morgan's headquarters at McMinnville. 2 officers were seriously wounded while creating a diversion to give Morgan time to put Maddie in the ambulance and send her racing out of town. John and his headquarters escort escaped on horseback across the field. Maddie was captured, but immediately released. This was a foretaste of what was to become habitual for Maddie. Flights before the enemy, lonely vigils, brief interludes with her husband in the summer of 1863. And during the Confederacy's farthest north raid, General Morgan was captured and imprisoned in Columbus, Ohio. He wrote to her 2 or 3 times a week in terms of cheer and confidence, but his concern for her steadily increased. During this time, the happy days were over for Maddie. She and Alice became wartime refugees in Knoxville, in Augusta, Georgia, in Knoxville again, and finally in Danville, Virginia. Maddie wanted to be as near Richmond as possible in order to do everything that she possibly could to speed up the parole of her beloved husband. When they heard that their brother Horace was wounded at Chickamauga, Alice hurried off to take care of him. Alone and desperately anxious, Maddie grew seriously ill. Her baby daughter was born prematurely and lived only a short time. General Morgan made his miraculous escape from the Ohio prison on November the 27th, 1863, the day his daughter was born, and managed to reach Maddie in time for Christmas. It was later felt by some that John's overwhelming desire to be with her inspired this reckless plan. There are various theories regarding this escape, including one that John's mother, Henrietta, may also have played a part in it. After the couple was reunited, they were more devoted than ever and more determined than ever to be together. They even made a covenant, which was most likely a verbal promise to each other to this effect. Maddie accompanied him to Richmond in early January of 1864 for a nearly 3-month ovation in the Capitol. They were wined and dined and made over extensively. He was celebrated as the South's great hero. Maddie enjoyed it all and continued to gain strength. At the end of March 1864, General Morgan was given command of the Confederacy's Southwestern Virginia Department, which included part of East Tennessee, and they moved to the headquarters in Abingdon, Virginia. This was Morgan's first and only departmental command, and one of the most undesirable in the entire Army. Definitely not the creme de la creme of the men of the same caliber of his former command. The next few months brought a different picture into focus. At this time in his career, Morgan was a very disenchanted man. There were clouds of suspicion and disgrace from previous unauthorized military actions hovering around him, and a court of inquiry threatening to ruin his career. His intense love for Maddie was the only bright spot in his life during this dark time. On his way back to Abingdon from what would be the last Kentucky raid, he wrote, "How very anxious I am to see you and to hold you in my arms. Do not think I shall permit myself to ever be separated from you again." His appearance indicated that he was a tired, sick man who had aged considerably. And Basil Duke, his brother-in-law and best friend, who had just been released from the Ohio prison, was appalled at the change in Morgan. The new command was a mixed group with many untrustworthy elements among them, while most of his former command was still in prison. On August the 28th, 29th, 1864, General Morgan and his men once again rode off from Abington, Virginia to Greenville, Tennessee. Even though Tennessee was a Confederate state, it was widely divided, and this part of East Tennessee was very pro-Union. Though strongly advised to the contrary on separating himself from his men, Morgan selected the largest and most comfortable house in the area for his headquarters, that of Mrs. Catherine Williams, a cousin of Mattie's mother. That day, September 3rd, 1864, he sent Mattie the last telegram she would ever get from him. Arrived here today, find that enemy have not been this side of Bull Gap and none there. Mrs. Williams had 3 sons, 2 of whom fought for the Confederacy, and 1 fought for the Union. The Union son was married to a woman named Lucy, a woman of questionable character. During the summer, while operating in Greenville, Tennessee, John Morgan had revoked the parole of a Union officer whom Lucy Williams had befriended, shall we say, and it was always believed by Morgan's family and friends that it was she who sought revenge. 4 days after leaving Mattie in Abington, a Union cavalry force commanded by Military Governor of Tennessee Andrew Johnson's Adjutant General Alvin C. Gillum surprised the Confederates, and John Hunt Morgan was shot and killed by Union Private Andrew J. Campbell, Company G, 13th Tennessee Cavalry. Ironically, the same Andrew J. Campbell, a native of Ireland and then Helena, Arkansas, had previously fought for the South and was a member of the 2nd Arkansas Infantry, General Pat Claiborne's command. Even more ironic, he was encamped just north of Murfreesboro at the time of Mattie and John's wedding, although there's no record of his ever having met Morgan and was certainly not a part of the same social circle. He deserted the Southern cause and then enlisted in the Union Army, and that's how he came to be in Greenville that fateful morning. Although there was no evidence to actually prove Lucy's betrayal as to informing the Federalists of Morgan's whereabouts, it was generally accepted that this was indeed the case. She herself never denied the accusations, and Joe Williams, her husband, began divorce proceedings almost immediately. He later visited the Reedy family in Murfreesboro and was warmly received. There are other theories as well as to who did actually inform the Federals as to Morgan's whereabouts. The real truth remains one of history's mysteries today. Morgan was the only headquarters officer killed, and many believe that he was murdered after surrender and his body desecrated. The facts from eyewitness accounts that his body was thrown over a mule, paraded around town before being dumped in a muddy ditch, devoid of almost all clothing, while his enemies shouted and screamed in savage exultation, certainly could not have made the burden any easier for Mattie to bear. Others feel that perhaps he chose death over surrender and indefinite separation from Mattie. Perhaps the covenant he and Mattie had agreed upon previously entered into his decision to gamble on life rather than death. That was on September 4th, 1864, the same day that Atlanta fell. Thus ended one of the greatest love stories of the war between the states. Their marriage had lasted a total of 630 days. Mattie learned of her husband's death and claimed his body under a flag of truce. Grief-stricken and pregnant, the 24-year-old widow returned to Augusta, Georgia to stay with relatives. There was one letter that she got from her mother, which was the only one that she had during the entire time. On February the 19th, 1865, Mattie's mother in Murfreesboro wrote the letter to her daughter in Augusta, Georgia. It would be the first correspondence between mother and daughter since John Morgan was killed on September the 4th, 5 months prior. The letter was very dim, very hard to read, and I could not include it in the PowerPoint, but in essence, it says, "My precious daughter, your sweet but sad letter came to hand last week, the first line from you since the death of your much-beloved husband. It gave me both pleasure and pain. Pleasure to know that you were well enough to write, and pain to think that I must still be separated from you. I cannot account for our letters not reaching you. I wrote twice a week, regularly after your crushing affliction, and said all that a mother could say to soothe and comfort a bruised child. But it seems as though you were not allowed the privilege of reading such letters. So, my dear, I could weep with you, but I do hope that the bitterness of your grief has passed and you're looking forward to an event which will cheer you and comfort you. Oh, that I could be with you. You must write and tell me when this distinguished personage will arrive. Just lay aside your delicacy, my dear, and tell me all. If the letter is read by a gentleman, if he is a husband and father, he will not speak of it. Such things between mother and daughter should be sacred, even among the lowest savage. We are getting along comfortably. The provost marshal has vacated our office, and your pa feels at home once more. This has been through General Rousseau's influence. I want you to know that he is a good man. I have a splendid photograph of your dear husband taken from the one that you sent, and intend to wreath it with flowers. Your ever and devoted, loving mother, M.A. Reedy. 7 months after the death of General John Hunt Morgan, Maddie gave birth to their daughter and named her Johnny. Johnny Hunt Morgan was born on April the 7th of 1865. The child was a great comfort to Maddie in her grief. In a letter to her mother-in-law, written a few months later, Maddie wrote, "She has indeed proved a blessing to me, direct from God, and the only happiness I look forward to in the future is that of rearing her. She is said to be a perfect little Morgan in appearance." During the summer of 1865, Maddie and little Johnny returned to her parents' home in Murfreesboro, where she devoted most of her time and energy to raising her young child and representing her late husband as the widow of a lost cause hero. Her involvement in the Ladies' Aid Society, which would eventually evolve into the Daughters of the Confederacy, brought both honor and remembrance to those living and dead who had fought for the South. But in 1865, the future must have been a very bleak one indeed for a young widow with a small baby. Her home, her family, and the Southern way of life she had previously known were gone forever. The period following the war years was a difficult time for everyone, and the Reedy family was no exception. Maddie remarried on January the 30th, 1873, after almost 8 years of widowhood. Her second husband was Judge William H. Williamson of Lebanon, a one-armed Confederate veteran and friend of both Maddie's father and sister Alice and her husband in Lebanon. They would become the parents of 5 children, and Johnny was known as a loving older sister. Johnny grew up to become an attractive, accomplished, lovely young woman, much like her mother. After her graduation, with distinction from Patapsco, Maryland, which was the same prestigious school her Aunt Alice had attended, she was described accordingly. In appearance, she is very much like her father, has a gifted mind, particularly in elocution, and in her manner has that peculiar magnetism that so characterized her father and gave him influence over men. Maddie remained true to her Southern philosophy, unable to let go of the past, even to the point of breaking off a romance between Johnny and a young man of pro-Union background. In the early 1880s, Maddie was described in prominent Tennesseans as noted for her fine address, intellectual vigor and cultivation, her strength of character, and devotion to her children. Handsome in person and clothed with the graces of the highest order of womanhood, she is naturally a great influence in the community. I have tried on that dress. It fits. Next slide, please.
But what are you wearing tonight?
Well, I have also, yeah, that too. Maddie would not appreciate that. Maddie would not appreciate that. Martha Reedy Morgan died on November the 16th, 1887, at the age of 47, possibly of yellow fever, most likely of tuberculosis, possibly both, just 8 months after her second husband. Her love for Morgan was apparent even after death. She is buried in the Williamson family plot at Cedar Grove Cemetery in Lebanon, and on her tombstone is the following inscription: Our mother, first the wife of General John H. Morgan, and then of Judge William H. Williamson. You saw the envelopes, the empty envelopes a few minutes ago, a few slides back. Those came into my possession from a family member with this story. 3 weeks before Maddie died, she had been quite ill, been living in Lebanon. And she was a woman of elegance and grace and a product of the Southern aristocracy. It was not like she would go outside in her night clothes. 3 weeks before she died, in her night clothes, she went out to the carriage house, and in the trunk, where her letters to and from John Morgan were, she burned them. She saved those envelopes, but she burned the letters, and those letters came into my possession. The envelopes, the empty envelopes, came into my possession from a family member. But it must have taken her last ounce of strength to get outside, even in her night clothes, and to be able to do that. That's how precious I believe those letters were to her. 6 months after her mother's death, Johnny married the Reverend Joseph W. Caldwell, a Presbyterian minister from Selma, Alabama. On June the 28th, 1888, at age 23, shortly after her honeymoon, Johnny died of typhoid fever, thereby leaving no direct descendants of John Hunt and Martha Reedy Morgan. Johnny was laid to rest near her mother, along with Judge Williamson and some of the other children, in Lebanon's Cedar Grove Cemetery. Ann Alice Reedy and her family are buried nearby, and keeping watch over all of them are the men from the 2nd Kentucky who were with John Morgan and killed in Lebanon in May of 1862, the year that it all began. Thank you for joining me on Maddie's journey from wife to widow, 630 days. I hope you've enjoyed Maddie's story. Thank you.